art existence, knowledge, and bliss. Salutations unto thee. May the world be peaceful. May the wicked become gentle. May all creatures think of mutual welfare. May their minds be occupied with what is spiritual and abiding. May our hearts be immersed in selfless love for the Lord. Peace, peace, peace be unto all. My talk tonight begins with the summary of Swami Saradananda, one of the direct disciples. Basically, he said to sum up the teachings in one verse, it would be like this. At all times we live and move in Brahman. Our life's daily dealings are only with Brahman. You are not aware of it, and you think you are doing so with different people and different objects. The sages of yore have shown us the way. Drive out ignorance, and the truth will be revealed to you. So that is his summary. So we're going to start and end with quotes from this Swami. But how do we get from that claim to realize that our dealings, our day-to-day dealings, are with Brahman and only with Brahman? And so that's what we're going to walk the way through the teachings and the examples provided to show us how we get there. So recently I saw a YouTube video by one of the California Swamis, Swami Harinamananda. And he gave this out at the Santa Barbara Temple in December. And he started his talk by asking the congregation, think back to the myths and the stories that you heard as a child and reflect on how they may have even influenced you to this very day. And so I wondered too, okay, so not only myths and stories that we've heard as childhood, but what about the books and the lectures and the teachings that we heard, especially when we first came to hearing about yoga and Vedanta. For some of us, it was fairly late in life. As American-born, we may not have come to Vedanta or yoga to our 30s or 40s. But for folks from India, you may have been part of it from childhood. So you want to think back to what those first teachings had on you as an influence. So I went back and I revisited some of the first books that I read when I first heard about yoga and Vedanta. Most of them I bought when we were across the street here in what used to be the little yellow building. And these are some of the first books that influenced me. And I realized as I went through and surveyed some of the topics how deep and how lasting those first few impressions were, even on my current understanding. And so religion and its practice is a compilation of writings and talks and lectures given by the direct disciples, and it was first published under the message of our master. It's been retitled to Religion and Its Practice, but the contents, at least according to the editor, is still the same information. Jnana Yoga and Raja Yoga, of course, are very well-known writings by Swami Vivekananda, and they contributed very greatly to my foundational understanding. And one thing that I remember from Raja Yoga, and I've read it numerous times, but the one lesson that really to this day is my anchor point, is he tells the story of the oyster and how during the rain there's a certain star called Svati, which is Arcturus in the Western nomenclature, but the oysters come up to the surface and they wait to catch a raindrop, and they catch the raindrop, and then they go back down and develop it into a pearl. Now, obviously, that's a parable. I don't think oysters can swim all the way to the top, but that wasn't the point. The point of Swami Vivekananda's use of that parable was once you get hold of an idea and you know it to be true because it resonates deep within your heart, never let it go and develop it. And it takes time to develop it, right? But sometimes that intuitional knowing, all right, I've heard the truth now, and now I've got to work on myself to eliminate the obstacles and find out how do I get to this realization. It's the same realization that Swami Saradananda said in the quote that I just said. If you realize, if you have this realization that all of our dealings are with Brahman and only with Brahman, then that is the end goal for Vedanta. So a person went to a doctor, and he had his finger, he had his finger stuck. He had his finger stuck into his eye. No, that wasn't part of the story, but he had his finger stuck in his eye all the way up to his knuckle, and the doctor looked at him and said, "What seems to be the problem?" And so he took his finger out of the eye, and he says, "Well, doctor, it hurts when I do this," and he jams his finger back into his eye. So the doctor looked at him for a minute and said, "Well, my advice is don't do that anymore." Okay? So again and again, Vedanta tells us the source of all pain and suffering is due to us taking the unreal for the real, and this mistake they call ignorance. And it distorts our thinking and motivates our actions in the wrong direction, because we seek happiness and pleasure from transient and temporal things. And then we get disappointed when these things do not deliver the permanent happiness that we were seeking. And so here the word things is not only material items, but it's specific situations and other non-tangibles such as fame and reputation, peace from going on to idyllic vacation locations, and momentary enjoyments from food and things like that. And of course the list is way too long to enumerate, and it's different for every person. So we're going to collectively call these situations and circumstances things by the generic word things. And just understand they're unique to all people, to each personality. And they're not wrong per se, okay? And they can and do bring maybe some short-lived satisfactions. However, Vedanta explains that such happiness derived in that way is subject to the laws of time and space, and therefore it inevitably fades, becomes stale over time, or ends in pain, always ends in pain or sorrow. For example, we can only eat so much food, no matter how tasty, before that enjoyment eventually turns to a feeling of bloated discomfort. And then that period of discomfort often lasts longer than the period of the meal itself, right? And I've seen many such situations. Even music, we fatigue of the finest music performed by the best musicians after a while, and we need a break. And these are just a few examples. Again, it's unique to each person, what they find joyful and happy, and things like that. But so, it seems like we continually stick our finger into our spiritual eye and blind ourselves to the truth, and then we go to the spiritual teacher and say, "It hurts when I do this." And the spiritual teacher says over and over, "Well, don't do that." But somehow we continue to do so in sometimes very subtle ways. And so Vedanta abstracts all of these objects in specific situations into a general category which we'll call sense objects. Now the text, the Drisha Viveka, provides us with a method of analysis and reasoning to help us separate the real from the unreal and ultimately identify the seeker as separate from all of these other categories called the seen. And when we succeed in actually doing this, not just as an intellectual exercise, but when we succeed in really doing it, we come to that which we really desire, which is the source of unchanging, unlimited happiness, the witness conscious, which they also call the Shakshi, and our true nature, which is unlimited existence, knowledge, and bliss. So I want to take a look at the first verse from that text, and it goes like this. The form is perceived, and the I is the perceiver. The I is perceived, and the mind is the perceiver. The mind is perceived, and the witness is the perceiver, but the witness is never perceived. And so now to make this clear, I put it in pictorial form, which we'll walk through. So let's take a look, the first verse. And here, form is perceived, and the I is the perceiver. So what I have is, I have a picture of the emblem, which is actually right above the door out here, that probably most of you came in through tonight. And you see that gets processed through the eyes into the organ of vision, which is located in the back of the brain, called the visual cortex. And then from that, we can separate out different forms and different colors. So we can see the snake, or we can see the sun, or we can see the lotus, or the waves, or we can see the entire emblem as a unit. So the forms and shapes as color and shape and color are many, but the eyes function as a single observer and are so considered one seer. Now, you may be tempted to say at this point, well, we have two eyes, so aren't there two seers? But of course, there is only a single processing center in the back of the brain. And in fact, according to yoga, all of the organs reside in the brain. The rest are just collecting elements. So the eyes are just collecting the light waves, the ears are just collecting the sound waves and such. So there is one sense organ for each of these. And so the various colors get impinging on the eyes and get routed through nerve impulses to the rear of the brain, and that produces the various forms that we see. Now, it's also interesting from a psychological standpoint that what we select out of our environment to see helps us with our self-study and our self-understanding, because what we select out of our environment to focus our attention on sometimes gives us hints and clues to what is motivating us at the subconscious level. Prior conditioning, prior experiences, especially those from early life or even from past lives. And so in the terminology of yoga and Vedanta, they're called samskara, or latent impressions. And in the Patanjali Yoga Sutras, we see how these latent impressions can awaken under different conditions which support that particular samskara awakening, and they influence our daily actions. And so Swami Yateshwarananda wrote a lot about this in his book, Meditation and Spiritual Life. It's also in Swami Vivekananda's Raja Yoga, and many other sources explain this in great detail. Now, Swami Harinamananda, in his talk at the Santa Barbara Temple, used the example of the person working into the Santa Barbara Temple. So somebody might walk in and focus on the altar. Somebody else, a different person, might walk in and maybe they're very devoted to Ramakrishna, so they may only focus on just the one picture of Ramakrishna on the altar. Somebody else may look and be amazed with the plants and the decorations. Somebody else may look at the building and the woodwork and the fancy altar. So what we pick out of our environment is a help in our self-understanding as well. Okay, so hopefully this part is clear, with the forms being perceived and the one perceiver being the organ of vision. So we're going to go more subtle. So this is kind of our gross level. Next, we're going to go to the next level, where the quality of the eyes is what is being observed, and the mind is the observer. Okay, and this is the second verse. So the mind is the perceiver, the seer, and the eyes, which were formerly the seer, are now the seen. So hopefully you're kind of following along with me. And so the mind knows the quality of the eyes, whether they're clear or clouded by cataracts or blurry due to distortions in the cornea, or maybe even after we come in from the outside on a very sunny day, we have reduced sensitivity for a while. We sometimes call that snow blindness, right? And the mind observes all of these changing conditions of the eye. And it also recognizes that these changes occur over time. So when I was younger, I used to have what they call 20/20 vision, which means I could see at 20 feet what was the standard you should be seeing at 20 feet. But now if I do this, and I look out at all of you, and I see two noses for every person, and Charlie waving 10 fingers, and two faces and two chins, but I don't associate that way. I don't say, what a funny group of people came to Vedanta to see me tonight, because I know that that's associated with the vision in my eyes, and it's not the property of the faces. So on the top right of that is how that emblem might look to me without my glasses on, or maybe to somebody else with uncorrected vision. However, in the bottom part of that picture, when the glasses are on, the glasses here being indicated by the yellow ovals, that same light processing is clear to me, okay? But it's the mind that knows. So here the states of the eye, the conditions of the eye are the observed, the seen, and the mind at this point is the seer. That's the second part of the first verse of that scripture. Let's go more subtle and let's dive deep. Okay. So here, the witness is the perceiver, and the states of the mind become the seen, okay? And so we can observe that our states of mind go through periods of happiness, unhappiness, anxiety, sadness, creativity, joy, even passive bliss in deep sleep. We might be creative or inspired, devotional, and many such things. And again, these happen over time. And so there's a subtle point here that I do want to make, that the witness consciousness who observes all of these changing states is not the same exercise as mental reflection or introspection, which is consciously taken up as we work through our self-study and our self-understanding. And so to do this, we have to ask ourselves two questions. Who is it that observes the state of deep sleep? How do we know if we didn't dream that night, we woke up and we still feel, that was a good sleep? Who was there to witness that state of unconscious passive bliss? And it's the same with this process of introspection. Who was there to watch us do this intentional self-introspection? And so there's also a faculty called the discriminating faculty of the mind. And this exists as a process of the mind. It's observed by the witness. But with a lot of practice, we train this discriminating faculty to help us make choices of which thoughts and feelings and emotions to act and select on. And these moods and feelings and thoughts come and go in time, triggered by different sensory inputs, which call to mind certain feelings, which then generate pleasant or unpleasant memories, or induce pleasant or unpleasant predictions. And in fact, it's been said that the anticipation of an event, such as a vacation or something, often generates more pleasure than the actual vacation itself or the event itself. Okay. And the ability to use this discriminating faculty of the mind to focus only on what it intends to focus on, without allowing any stray thoughts to intrude and cause unwanted interruptions, is called purity of mind by Swami Prabhavananda. Okay. And there's an interesting story that's told by Swami Savapriyananda of New York, actually. He tells a story when he was a young monastic, and he was out on a walk with some other brahmacharis and maybe some other young monks, with a very senior teacher, the teacher that was designed to oversee his group. And Swami Savapriyananda, being a young monk, he said he saw a creeper there with some beautiful flowers, and he decided he was going to smell the flower. So he leaned over and smelled the flower. And I'm going to quote from the way he tells the story. He says, that senior Swami, he said, he whipped around to me and said, "What is that? Just because you get something, does it have to become boga, enjoyment?" And he says, when he tells the story, how that incident left a very strong impression on him, even to this very day, because he's telling the story rather recently while he's here in U.S. managing the New York Center, but this was something that happened to him as a young monk. And there's a second part of that lesson. I'm just going to defer it till a little later, but it's something that I perceive as a very subtle lesson in that, and we're going to get to that a little bit later. But even our Pravrajika Gita Prana, when she talks, gives her talks here, she says when you recognize something undesirable going on in your mind, you need to, the terminology she uses is reboot and load a different app. Okay, but this is the same way, a modern way perhaps, of explaining how Swami Prabhavananda teaches on purity of mind. We need to stop these unwanted interruptions in our mind. And what happens if we don't have it? Well, we find ourselves either living in the past or trying to predict the future, and then our efficiency at any task at hand suffers from these distractions and interferences. And so our performance, the quality of our work goes down. We find we introduce mistakes or we don't get enough done, right? But through introspection and practice, we develop our determinative faculty to give us some control, to the ability to reboot and load the different apps, so to speak. and to focus on one idea which we want to focus on to the exclusion of all else. And why is that important? Well, we'll see at the very end of the talk why that ability is so important. But it's important to develop this control, and I remember back many years ago when I used to come, we used to come as a small group. There was a lady named Trevini, who was, she used to teach yoga at the Y. I met her in taking that class, and she told me about Vedanta Providence. And her husband, Pran, they were in the 70s when I met them, and Vishwanath, and we all used to meet at Trevini's house and then come here for the Friday class, the Saturday class, the Sunday class as a group. And Trevini, a very nice person, was susceptible to some hiccuping or something, especially after soup supper and things. And we would ride home, on the ride home, and that would start with her. And so we came up with this little game. And I said, all right, on the count of 3, all 4 of us are going to yell as loud as we can, "Stop it!" And we'll do it together. And so we'd go 1, 2, 3, "Stop it!" And she would also participate. And wouldn't you know, many, many times, the hiccups would instantaneously stop. Now, it might be just that she resynchronized her diaphragm by participating in this explosive outburst to join the group, or maybe it had psychological subtle things, or both, okay? But it's interesting because if you go back to the newsletter from this week, February 13th newsletter, the words "stop it" are actually there from Swamiji's lecture, okay? And so many of the ideas that I'm talking about appeared in last week's newsletter. Now, I didn't go and plagiarize or anything because I came to reading the newsletter only last week, but it's very interesting how the word "stop it" appears there, as well as some of these ideas that you're only interacting with Brahman and we're only seeing Brahman at any and all times. So if you doubt that, you can go back and check me on this last newsletter. There's the Svetashvatara Upanishad summary from the 8th, and then February 10th, Seeing the God, and Swami explained last week exactly why he put that word "the" in the title, right? Seeing the God. So that's all of that is there. So one Vedantic analogy for the witness uses a street light as an example, and it's something I kind of like. It says the street light illumines the play of children at dusk, a wedding procession in the early evening, a crime at midnight, and the stillness of the early dawn. All of these are illuminated by its light, but the street light does not associate itself with any of these events and is unaffected by any of those events. So I depicted that by doing this. All of these different states that come and go through our mental processing are illuminated by this one witness consciousness. And this experiential knowledge, as an experience, not just as an intellectual exercise, is the goal of all Vedantic teachings and practices. And it was, again, it was reflected in that opening verse that I started with, that we are interacting with Brahman and Brahman alone. And we have to make this, we have to experience this. And when we do, this will bring the permanent happiness that we all seek. Everything else is just temporal. It comes and goes. Only knowledge can remove the ignorance, and it's this knowledge that we really want. And so this purity of mind that it takes to experience this as described by Swami Prabhavananda, is difficult to achieve. So the teachers of Vedanta have come up with many methods which lead all the students, towards this realization of truth. And each method is based on personality, the psychological makeup of each of us. And so there are many methods. And the approach is somewhat individual in nature, but all eventually lead to the same goal. And so now we're going to take a look at what some of the teachings have been, and the means and the mechanism by which they lead sincere followers to this truth proclaimed by Vedanta. So we're going to look now at what I'll call direct teachings. And so the first thing I wanted to point out, or that came to my mind as I was putting this talk together, is that stories, or any information, when it's repeated multiple times, inevitably gets modified or changed. Okay, and there's a simple party game. Maybe you've played it when you were young. We could probably even do it at a retreat one day here. But you take several people, like 7 people in a row. And the first person has a script, a few sentences or a poem, or maybe just a few words of some story that's not familiar to anybody. That's the important piece of it. And what the first person does is they whisper into the ear of the person immediately beside them, and they're reading from the script. So you know there's one faithful transmission of it exactly as it appears on the script. But then the second person has to repeat it to the third person without benefit of the script. And then the third person has to repeat it to the fourth person without benefit of the script. And you go down, and maybe you go down 7, 8 people, and then the last person has to tell it to the group. And then the person with the script rereads what was originally told. And you'll be surprised how often the story, new information gets added, other information gets removed, other information gets changed, right? So the story at the end. So that's why I thought it was important to go back to some of the original teachings, especially in the context. It's also helpful to understand the context and the culture when the original teachings came up, because, as I said, things change. Every translation in cultural norms, every shift in cultural norms can influence our understanding and alter the interpretation of the original, and this may be intentional or unintentional. And Swami Ranganathananda actually wrote a 4-volume set about this. It was called Eternal Values for a Changing Society. So there he recognized the societal norms, the values, the different changes in the society will change, but these Vedantic teachings, these truth teachings, are eternal. But how do you deliver them to an ever-increasingly changing society? And I had this discussion earlier when I got here with Joan a little bit, how we were saying all churches, and a lot of churches are seeing these days, decreasing interest in smaller congregations, because the current society, at least in the West, seems to have lost that connection that, even though it's probably needed more than anything right now, for some reason they're struggling to see value in such teachings. So that's a challenge for us going forward, especially raising young people today, to say that yes, value is not only the materialistic elements of the society, but spiritual values will enrich the culture and transfer the world to the next generation in a better shape than living without these spiritual things. So think of yoga, for example. If I did a survey right now of modern people, especially perhaps in the West, but not necessarily just in the West, yoga, I think you'll find that yoga is thought of physical exercise, maybe good for slimming the body, losing weight, maybe a little relaxation, and a little flexibility. But much of the original intent of yoga as a spiritual discipline seems to have been lost or watered down, ignored, or just simply forgotten. I remember when I did go to Triveni for the first time, and it was after having read Swami Vivekananda's Raja Yoga. She went around her class group, and she said, well, why are you here? And most people said, well, I want to get a little relaxation, I want to lose a little bit of weight, whatever. And then she got to me and probably got an answer she wasn't expecting. I said, well, I read about this thing called samadhi, and I want to learn that. And yeah, exactly. So she kind of chuckled too, and she said, well, this is only a YMCA yoga class. If you want that, go down to Providence, Rhode Island, and talk to, at the time it was Swami Savagatananda. He had just retired, actually, so I didn't get to hear him lecture, but she did take me up to his room, and it was when it was across the street. and I got to talk to him for a few minutes. But that was how I started coming here, and clearly there's a lot more to it than what gets taught in a YMCA. But that's the point of it, right? So if we go to an original source like the Patanjali Yoga Sutras or the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, we find that there was much more to it than that. And even the Hatha Yoga Pradipika says outright that if you practice Hatha Yoga without Raja Yoga, you're wasting time and wasting effort. And it also says that asana, postures, which are typically associated with yoga as the main factor, are only accessories to the practice of Hatha Yoga. And so we know an accessory to something is not the primary component, but just an auxiliary, right, meant to augment or ornament or support in some way. So Vedantic teachings take many forms, which are useful for different students in according to their temperament and personalities and capabilities and situations. And different teachings are required for different periods of societal evolution, as I had mentioned. For example, Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Brahmananda taught that japam, bhakti, and self-surrender is the best method for what they call Kali Yuga, which is the period which is governing this time in life. And there's a very complex, if you follow the Vedic astrology, there's numbers and 432,000 of so many days, and you multiply this and this, and I didn't work my way all the way through it. So I'll just trust those that had the patience to work through it. But they decided that this current era is, or this current yuga is Kali Yuga. And so some of the trainings that we get are preliminary trainings for establishing the student in basic disciplines. You can't start with a completely undisciplined person. And we know this is true in any field, really, not just religion. Lifting weights in a gymnasium, a person would not start with 200 pounds if they couldn't first lift 100 pounds and then 150 pounds and so on. A runner should not attempt a 26-mile marathon if you can't do 5 miles of a basic training run, right? In music, we start with simple scales and simple meters, and then gradually go on adding complexity. And the same holds true for swimmers and even physical asanas of yoga. And so teachings come in all forms: parables and stories, analogies, philosophical reasoning. The teacher may give a student a specific task designed to increase one's attention to detail, or the teaching may help to develop a person's ability to quickly analyze a situation and develop what I'll call real-time or spontaneous solutions, right? And so this is where I want to come back to the story of Swami Savapriyananda and point out what I thought was a very subtle, he didn't point this out, but it was a lesson that I was able to extract. So remember what happened now. So Swami Savapriyananda was walking with some brahmacharis or maybe some other monks. And they were with a very senior Swami. So obviously, if you're assigned to overseeing young Swamis and brahmacharis, you know, you got to be top of your game there, right? So maybe that's not the right phrase, but you have to be a very seasoned monk because you're now training the next generation. So just understand, they're there with a very senior Swami when Swami Savapriyananda stopped to smell the creeper. And remember what happened, so I'm going to just quote it again. He says there that the Swami whipped around and said to me, "What is this? Just because you get something, does it have to become bhoga, enjoyment?" And so obviously the lesson was meant for Swami Savapriyananda there, and he admits that he remembers it to this day. But the subtle lesson that I got from hearing that anecdote or that recall was this. It had to do with situational awareness and the consciousness, the expanded consciousness of that senior Swami. Because think about it. If you're out on a walk with several people, other things going on around you, the behavior you wanted to correct happened either to your side in your peripheral vision or even behind you. And I get that because he said the Swami whipped around. And whipped around implies a reorientation of your body, almost either completely reverse or significantly to one side or the other. So think about it. Think about it carefully. That senior Swami may have been leading the group with the juniors behind him, and yet he was able to detect a behavior that he wanted to correct out of a whole group. And he whipped around and said to him, hey, what is this, right? So this situational awareness comes with expanded consciousness. And ultimately, in the limit, as our consciousness gets expanded, in Christianity, Jesus says the Father knows all, even the fall of the sparrow in the remote corner of the world. And yogis also say they can feel and perceive the sensations of all. So you become one with all, the consciousness of all. And so collectively, all of the teachings and all of the different methods were grouped into what they call 4 yogas by Swami Vivekananda: Bhakti, Raja, Jnana, and Kama Yoga. And so some of the things I've just been speaking about, the specific tasks given by a spiritual teacher or guru, are along the lines of Kama Yoga. They want you to do something for a specific reason, and it's to drive you in this direction of realizing the oneness. Or you're given a specific worship practice with so many repetitions of the mantra and things. And again, you're trusting here your spiritual guru or your spiritual leader that they're taking you, even though it's a path that you may not fully see how this is going to get me to this Vedantic ideal. If you have faith and you trust the sincerity of that person, you do as expected, and it is contributing to your spiritual growth, okay? So that's the sort of the Kama Yoga, the Bhakti Yoga. I started with Jnana Yoga with the Drisha Viveka example, and we talked a little bit about the Raja Yoga too, with the meditation and the purity of mind, as we heard from Swami Prabhavananda's example of what he defines as purity of mind, which is the ability to prevent all unwanted distractions from entering your mind. And we're going to close with why that ability is so important on this path. But now I want to just give a few thoughts on something called direct knowledge. What is direct knowledge? So obviously when I say direct knowledge, that implies something called indirect knowledge, and I'll say those are probably mutually exclusive categories. So let's take a look at what Vedanta has to say about each of those. So I want you to quickly answer to yourself right now, just quickly in your mind, who am I, where am I right now? So just do it, boom. Okay, so most of us would answer along the following ways. Well, I'm in Vedanta Society in Providence, Rhode Island. I'm seated in a certain chair. I'm seated next to a friend, or some similar ways. Or for our online viewers, they may say I'm here in my living room, watching on my cell phone, or watching on the YouTube on my computer on our live stream. But for students who have even studied just a bit of Vedanta, will know that Vedanta will say that as it regards the true self, none of those statements are true, okay? It may be true for the physical body or the most dense part of the energy field, which I can call localized in this region right here. But even for the mind, and this is a point that Swami Yogatmananda always reminds us, although we can be physically sitting here, the mind can be in tomorrow, planning the day's work. The mind can be in yesterday, recalling something that happened yesterday. You could be planning the summer's vacation, or you could be, recounting something that happened weeks or years ago. And we know that memory is a very important trigger for starting these thought chains. And oftentimes I find myself thinking about something, and I go, "How did I get on to that?" Because I started in a place that's completely different from where I was at that particular moment. And so these statements of locality are not true for the Atman, which is said to be identical with Brahman, omnipresent and timeless, or put in another way, beyond space and time. But do we really experience it, is the question, right? Again, we can assign intellectual assent to these ideas, and they may satisfy us at an intellectual level, but until we experience it, only then is the doubt and the ignorance removed. So we have to experience it. And I'll let each of you answer to yourself, but since it's my role here to be at the podium today, let me lead a discussion, a bit of a discussion, and put forth some analysis versus direct knowledge versus indirect knowledge. So we'll take a look at indirect knowledge first. Okay, so indirect knowledge, if we take a look at the properties of each of our 5 senses, we can get some idea of the situation, or maybe the almost hopelessness of the situation. Eyes and ears that are seeing and hearing bring us information from the world that is apparently, or seems to be primarily outside of the skin frame boundary, okay? So I see things that appear to be outside of me coming from a distance. I hear things that appear to be external to my skin frame boundary. And unless we have X-ray vision, we typically do not see the inside of the skin covering, except maybe in some thin areas where we can see some veins and some minor structures. Hearing, again, is primarily external. And, you know, maybe some, we can hear a heart pound once in a while or some gurgling, but primarily it's external. And things. However, certain spiritual practices allow one to see and hear different categories of internal phenomena, such as self-luminous light and certain sounds, one of which is called anahata, meaning the unstruck sound. And they're described in some of the yoga texts as a guide for the students. Swami Vivekananda mentions some of these in his Raja Yoga, and Swami Yatishwarananda also in his book Meditation and Spiritual Life. And then the question comes, well, are they true? Can subtle internal sounds really be heard? Can self-luminous internal light really be seen? And I think the phenomenon of dreams gives us a hint that it may be possible, just because in the dream state, most people will say that I have seen pictures, or I have heard sounds, or maybe even felt contact with some dream objects. And again, this is building towards a very important closing here, so keep these thoughts in mind as we continue to go forward. How it relates to the final Vedantic teaching of the experience, of the one experience. Smell, again, is more or less an external sense, bringing us information from outside the skin frame boundary, as well as taste. Ayurveda science made a great study of the interaction of different tastes. They classify different tastes and the interaction of all substances. And that's why it comes down to us today, certain combinations of food, whether the original analysis is recalled or not. But if I said to you very quickly here, think of a spice you'd have with an apple. Anybody? Cinnamon, okay, so the Ayurvedic analysis goes something like this. Apples have a high air content, not necessarily this kind of air, but the way they classify it is air. And cinnamon is a spice which is full of fire, right? And we know if we take pure cinnamon, we even taste it, it tastes warm. So the interaction of the fire and the air creates the moisture, which adds the third element and creates a balance between all three. Okay, so that's a simple Ayurvedic analysis of why you would use cinnamon with apples, okay? And they've done this for all the substances, but that's another whole aside and another whole talk. But all of these ingredients and all of these recipes were scientifically designed based on this. So a lot of, you'll see like cucumbers offered with yogurt, yogurt. That I never saw in the Western, but you see that when I go to like Indian restaurants and stuff. And again, yogurt is thick. It's got the high fat content, all right, the kapha content. But the cucumbers are kind of watery. So again, it helps to cut through the density of the yogurt. Okay, so enough of that. That's another whole talk. But I have to explain the slide that you're seeing here. And so the left side of that picture comes directly from the Katha Upanishad, verse 1.3.3. And the verse goes like this. The self is the rider of the chariot. The body is the chariot. The intellect is the charioteer, the one making the decision. The mind is the reins. The senses are the horses. And the sense objects are the different paths those horses can pull us towards. So the idea here in that picture is coming out of the person's mind are the reins controlling the 5 horses that if they're not properly controlled by the intellect, the charioteer, will lead us to the ditch, to the disaster. But if we do properly harness our sense organs, our horses, we can stay on the spiritual path. And we see that too, I think, in the Friday class, the Svetashvatara Upanishad that Swami is currently giving. Here they talk about the wheel with 3 rims and the 50 spokes and everything, and that wheel goes down the different roads. And it's kind of it's a different way of saying this same kind of analogy about controlling where you're going and how you do it. But touch seems to be the most dominant sense in establishing this illusion of localized consciousness. And skin being the largest sensory organ in the body, we tend to associate the eye with this body boundary, and by the inputs of heat and cold, soft, firm, smooth, rough, and all of these things. And then, because the consciousness seems bounded by these things and localized in time and space, then we have this localized pool of consciousness, and it appears to have a fixed location in space. But not only that, there's a problem. It becomes me and my consciousness. And the I then seems separated from the universal field of consciousness. And so I feel cut off from the whole. And so once we establish this skin frame boundary, everything else gets referenced to it. The sound, the sight, the smells. And if you think about it, just take a quick minute, it all seems to have a focal point somewhere about right here. You can test your own and see if it agrees with your experience. But now I've cut myself off from the whole by creating this skin frame boundary. And everything that comes to us this way is limited, and all of these sensory inputs are subject to the same kind of distortions and errors and biases that any mechanical measuring devices are. Okay, so all of the information we get this way is called lower knowledge in the terminology of yoga and Vedanta. So in the last few minutes, let's talk about direct knowledge. What it is, how do we get it, and how do the teachers, especially the ancient, the original disciples, the direct disciples, tell us we need to acquire this knowledge. And so the first question I would ask is, well, is it possible, right? And so over here on the right hand of the screen, direct knowledge requires no sensory inputs. Truth is directly perceived. It's universal and not limited. And it's intuitionally received, okay? So how do we get there? And so the equation, the funny equation at the top, this comes from Srinivasa Ramanujan, one of the famous mathematicians. That's another whole story, the man who knew infinity. But basically, he used to meditate on his goddess, and his goddess would give him the equations, and he'd write them down in his notebook. And he sent like 2 volumes to England, to some of the most famous mathematicians over there. And they were going to reject it out of hand because that involves 4K factorial with K going to infinity. You can't even calculate that on a modern day computer probably. The numbers get so big so quickly. But how do you prove it? And they looked at it and they said, this just can't be right. But finally, William Hardy took him under his wing. And they finally showed that a lot of this stuff, which he intuitionally received from his goddess in meditation, was phenomenal work. And he created 2 volumes just from this intuitional study. But that's still not where we want to go with Vedanta, of course, but it's perhaps a stepping stone. So in his book, Raja Yoga, Swami Vivekananda wrote the following. He says, all of the sensations and motions of the body are being sent into the brain and sent out of it through these wires of nerve fibers. The columns of sensory and motor fibers in the spinal cord are the Ida and Pingala of the yogis. They are the main channels through which the afferent and efferent nerve currents travel. But why should the mind not send news without any wire or react without any wire? The mind has made this network of nervous system and has to break it, so that no wires will be required to work through. Then alone will all knowledge come to us, no more bondage of the body. By long internal meditation, layer after layer of the mind opens up, and this universe is perceived in its fine and causal form. Then alone the causes of this universe, as sensation, as reaction, are known, as they are, and hence comes all knowledge. The causes being known, the effects are sure to follow. The yogi says it can be done. And so he opens this book, Raja Yoga, which one of the most influential in my foundation, because it was the first one I read. He says here, each soul is potentially divine. The goal is to manifest its divinity by controlling nature, external and internal. Do this by work, we've already talked about a little bit, or worship. We already talked a little bit, we're going to talk a little more. Psychic control or philosophy, we already did an example. By one or more or all of these and be free. This is the whole of religion. And so we did a little bit of Jnana Yoga analysis. And in his introduction to Jnana Yoga, Swami Vivekananda wrote about the origin and history of religion. And he contrasted two hypotheses which he thought were the foundations of religion. And he said the first was ancestor worship. We want to understand death. What happens beyond, if anything at all? The competing hypothesis that Swamiji pointed out was the personification of nature with its beautiful dawns and sunsets and assigning attributes to these thunder and lightning and storms and personifying them. And you see this in sort of the Greek gods, the Roman gods, and even some of the ancient Indian gods that have superpowers and all kinds of powers. And Swami says that there are arguments for both, and he goes through that detailed analysis of both in that introduction. But then he did a very interesting thing. He added his own information to this, and he says the tug of war between these two hypotheses can be broken by introducing a third idea. He says both can be understood in the context of attempts to go beyond the senses. And so whether it was wondering about what lies beyond, as in life after death, or wondering or being mystified or amazed by the powers of nature or her secrets, both inquire human beings to consider this idea of going beyond the bodily to achieve higher potentials. And so we see this sometimes, especially in the West, as attempts to extend the senses and push the limits of the body to increasing levels of skill and performance. We see scientific equipment, such as microscopes and CAT scans and MRIs, really enhancing or developing the capabilities of our eyes and ears to limits that are extreme and subtle in such ways. Chemistry and genetics now can detect the presence of minute qualities of impurities and pathogens and cancers that normally the untrained senses in their ordinary state cannot perceive. We see it in the spirit of the Olympics in every generation. You know, there were, back in the day, they would do one twirl or two twirls. Now they're up to 4 and 5, right? And you're continually extending the feats. The words of Beethoven and many other musicians and scientists say that art and science can raise humankind to deity by allowing us intense concentration. And we see it in the ingenuity of science and technology, which has allowed space travel to the most extreme regions. And just a bit of an aside, but it's a fun aside, I hope you enjoy this, is on January 1st of this year, there was a spaceship called the New Horizons spacecraft. Now listen to this. Listen to these numbers. It was 4 billion with a B miles away from Earth on January 1st, 2019. It was 285,000 miles when it took that picture away from an object that's 4 billion miles away. So think of trying to direct something from the Earth 4 billion miles away and come within 250,000 miles of it, okay? That's some pretty accurate driving, okay, if you think about it. But the fun continues, and the fun continues in the following way. 2 years before the spacecraft got out there and took that photograph, and got it back to Earth, by the way, that's another part of the amazing part of this thing. They actually got it and downlinked all of that digital data from 4 billion miles away, and we were able to pick it up out of it. You think how weak that signal is. But the fun part of it is 2 years before they took this, they knew this object, 4 billion miles away, was going to pass in front of a certain star in the constellation Sagittarius. Now think about it. You go outside. How big is a star? It's like a pencil dot in the sky. And they knew this thing, which you can barely see. I mean, you can't see it. It's not too much bigger probably than this building. Is going to pass in front of this star. And they said, well, you know what? Let's figure out what this thing looks like. So imagine they know this thing passing in front of a point of light out in the constellation Sagittarius, some numbers of light years away. They were able to predict where on the Earth the shadow of this thing was going to fall. They traveled to that part of the Earth and putting down God knows what kind of sensory measuring photography equipment and everything. We're going to measure the shadow of this thing 4 billion miles away as it passed briefly in front of this star light years away. And they did, and they got a photo of the shadow. And they said, 2 years before the spacecraft got this picture, they said, this thing's going to look like a figure 8. Pretty good. So sorry for taking you on this aside, which is one of my personal hobbies, space science and things. But as amazing as these things are, they still fall in the domain of what Vedanta calls indirect knowledge. Okay, we're still dealing with the things of the world. So ultimately, we see in the science of yoga and Vedanta practices which are not attempts to extend or enhance the senses and performance of the body, but to go completely beyond. Okay, and Swamiji said too that at the limit, both approaches, if you proceed to the extremes of both will meet, as if you're going around a circle from two different directions. Both will eventually meet at a common point. But Vedanta and yoga pursue the internal path. But even Ernst Schrödinger, one of the physicists, said, which was a very Vedantic idea, that consciousness is never experienced in the plural. Okay? One universal consciousness. And even quantum entanglement, which is kind of one of the things in vogue right now, they say that all information resides on a sphere of infinite radius, and this world of time and space are just a projection of that infinite sphere, and that's very similar, in my mind, to the Vedantic idea of the movie and the screen or the streetlight examples that we saw earlier. So in his book, Christ the Messenger, Swami Vivekananda explained the whys of these two different approaches. And he says there that the Asian culture, being older, had had enough of the vicissitudes of fortune, of kingdoms, and the glories of nature. It had seen it all, being such an old culture. So it wanted to take the search into the internal realm, first encountering and exploring the subconscious, the depths of the subconscious, the subtle, and ultimately transcending all to the state of eternal bliss. And so I'm going to quote here a little bit. By this time, the search was inward, more deeply. And what was discovered were states higher than the waking state or the dreaming state. The state we find in all organized religions called ecstasy or inspiration. All prophets and messengers declare they went into states of mind that were neither waking or sleeping, in which they came face to face with a new series of facts relating to what is called the spiritual kingdom, where things were realized much more intensely than the facts of the waking state. And that's the end quote. So I'm just about out of time. So just to wrap up, I started the talk by saying we're all on an eternal quest for happiness. Not temporary happiness which comes and goes, but permanent happiness. And we all seek in various ways for some time. But ultimately, according to yoga and Vedanta, this reaches its culmination from an internal process, and the result is called Nirvikalpa Samadhi. So the search that we begin our life ends this way, and I started with a quote from Swami Sarada Ananda, which says that we have to realize that all of our dealings are with Brahman and Brahman alone. And so in his article, or his talk, as recorded in The Religion in Its Practice, one of the first books that I read, he describes the practice of bhakti and how it itself, this practice, leads to the same nirvikalpa samadhi. And so I'm just going to close by quoting from The Spiritual Aspect and Spiritual Practices, Religion and Its Practices by Swami Saradananda, one of the direct disciples. And quoting, he says, "The image becomes living, and it is possible for the devotee to feel its divine touch and hold talks with it." And then he explains how this leads to the same realization of the philosophical analysis of the jnani. And again, this is an excerpt from his article. "Thus, by meditating on one object of the thought world, the perceptions of the gross external world disappear altogether. And when one gets the idea of holding the mind so strongly, all other ideas fall off from it." This is that purity of mind that Swami Prabhupada says we must have, and that's why it was so important. I made that point several times tonight. "The bhakta who has advanced so far is not far off from the state of nirvikalpa samadhi. As a result, soon comes to realize the sensation of all mentations, and soon crosses the thought world, realizes the absolute unity, and thereby attains eternal bliss. Thus have been described in our Shastras the two processes of jnana and bhakti for reaching the state of nirvikalpa samadhi." So with that, I'm going to conclude my talk in this very brief survey. My original intent was to actually survey teachings of each of the direct disciples, but I realized that would be probably a several-week series, so I just had to excerpt a little bit, and then my scientific part of my mind got involved, and it ended up being what it was, but hopefully it was worth your time. So these were sort of the 4 references that I used for this, and literally just scratching the surface of what's contained in each of them. So each one of them is worth a study on their own. And I continually to reread, because every time I do another pass-through, I pick up some fine point or learn something. So with that, my references and my public domain statements are there if you want. And my salutations to all the direct disciples and all of the teachings that have benefited my life so far. And may we all be one day blessed with that experience of nirvikalpa samadhi as soon, and please help, may it be soon, divine grace that we are ready for such an experience. Thank you, friends. Okay, so now we will have the announcements and then the closing prayer and then arati. Of course, you're all invited for soup supper, which will follow, and then meditation back here after the soup supper. So let me do the announcements first. Swami Yogatmananda is back, as you can see. So the Tuesday and Friday classes will go on as usual. Next Sunday, the talk will be given by Swami Yogatmananda, and the topic is Observation and Inferences by Ramakrishna. There's a day-long spiritual retreat coming up on Saturday, March 23rd from 9:30 a.m. to 7 p.m., and that's by Swami Atmarupananda. It says Houston. Did he get reassigned from, okay, formerly of D.C., now of Houston?
No, he was never in D.C.
He was never...
That is Swami Atmajnana.
My apologies, yes, correct. So yeah, no, I should have, yeah, my mistake. I apologize. So from Swami Atmarupananda of Houston, the topic is Vedantic mindfulness. The registration fee is $20 if you register by March 14th, so we give a big discount for those who respond early. Otherwise, you go to full price of $30. You can register at the website or with the form on the back of the monthly flyer, or you can see Naomi in the bookstore. So however you want to register, I would say please get your registration in early to allow for proper planning, sizing of supplies and materials, and making arrangements of groups if necessary and things like that. I think that's it for announcements, so we can now do the closing prayer. You can please repeat along with me. May the divine, who is Father in heaven of the Christians, Holy One of the Jewish faith, Allah of the Muslims, Buddha of the Buddhists, Tao of the Taoists, Great Spirit of the Native Americans, Ahura Mazda of the Zoroastrians, and Brahman of the Hindus, lead us from the unreal to the real, from darkness to light, from death to immortality. May the all-loving being manifest unto us and grant us abiding understanding and all-consuming divine love. Peace, peace, peace be unto all. We'll now have arati.